Okay, it's good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 5's live Q&A session for Tech for Good, the role of ICTs in achieving the SDGs. This week's expert session is with Guilherme Canela Godoi, Regional Advisor for Communication and Information, UNESCO Montevideo Office. I am Sandra, and I will be moderating this 30-minute session. We've had some great questions this week, which I've selected a few for Guilherme to answer. Welcome, Guilherme.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm speaking from Bogota, Colombia. Here is 7 a.m. in the morning, so very glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you very much. So, Guilherme, we've had some interesting questions this week. So, the first question we have is, often the focus is on technology, but you've pointed out that there are other important areas to be considered. How can countries ensure that access, quality, and equity are provided for as they develop strategies for ICT for education and education for ICTs?
Super. This is a great question. I think this is in the core of should be in the core of the decision-making process when developing this kind of policies, should be in the center of the attention of member states, or when they are improving, developing, fostering anything related to ICTs for education or education for ICTs. The key element here is the motto of the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind, but actually how to do it. First, it's very, very, very important to keep a mindset of monitoring and evaluation when assessing, developing the ICTs for education policies. If we don't know where the problems are, it's very difficult to include those elements. Another important element is to consider more in depth what those elements, accessibility, equity, equality, means. For instance, accessibility is a very broader concept that must include accessibility to the technology, to the connection to the internet, but also should consider specific populations, like in countries where you have many languages being spoken, you need to consider multilingualism. You need to consider people with disabilities. You need to consider different ethnic groups. You need to consider girls, women. So it's very important that we move forward in a sense that not only considering the broader concept, but go into the specific elements of context in each country. As I said when I was developing the videos for the module, it's crucial for all of those three elements, accessibility, equity, and the other element, inequality of education, to think and to be clear which education we want to offer. If we don't have an answer for that question, it's very difficult to develop specific strategies for improving accessibility, equity, and quality. And finally, I would say that it's essential more and more to have a multi-stakeholder perspective. I mean, while or as building those policies, including the perspective of the students, of the families, of the teachers, of the principals of schools, are crucial to guarantee more accessibility, equality, and equity. So summarizing, multi-stakeholder perspective, more monitoring and evaluation to know where the problems are, and have a plural perspective on what we mean for those three elements that were mentioned.
Brilliant. Thank you, Guilherme. Very nicely answered. The second question we have is about big data. And one of this learner says that big data is claimed to have the potential to contribute to education, both for monitoring and assessment, and to facilitate more personalized education. Can you please elaborate further on this? What is the big data to be concerned here? And what does the research in the field in this area look like?
It's a good question, although we need to specify or to be clear that big data is a kind of a very broad concept that accommodates many different things. So when we are talking about big data, we are actually talking about a computerized way of assessing data related to a specific policy. In this case, for instance, education and ICT for education. So we are talking about data mining, different elements or different strategy of analyzing data to get a good result in a specific policy. So in the case of education, it's clear that the governments, they have lots of data related to the schools, to the students, to the teachers, in terms of how they are performing, in terms of with what kind of equipment infrastructure is distributed to schools. Imagine, for instance, a country like Brazil that have 50 million students in the public school network system. So you can really have a lot of data that can help policymakers and decision makers to actually take better decisions related to any specific elements under the big umbrella of the educational policies. It's important again to realize that although now very accessible on our hands, you need to know what questions you will address to the data. It's not only having lots of information, as I have said, you need to have strategies to transform that information into knowledge. And for that, there is no computer. You need to understand what you want as a decision maker. You need to have an horizon. What you want to achieve in 1 year, in 2 years, in 20 years. If you don't have that planning, it's very difficult to use big data or computer sciences to assess the data in the benefit of the policy. A final word on that is very important. Governments also should improve their strategies of open data, making these big data available according to the standards of open data, so that others, families, civil society organizations, academics also can work with that data in order to help to improve the quality of education in any given country.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. I just want to elaborate a little bit on the data one. You mentioned that policymakers need to know what they're looking for to understand what data they need to source and then transfer that into information. So does there need to be a capacity building process for them to really understand how they should be looking for this data and what kind of information they should be looking for? Or do you have any tips in this sense?
Yeah, sure. Actually, this MOOC is about that, isn't it? So institutions like CETIC.br, that is one of the co-organizers of this MOOC, their mission is precisely that, to assist Latin American and governments and Portuguese-speaking countries, governments in Africa, on how to use better the data, how to use better the ICTs, to take informed policy decisions. So capacity building is essential here because this is all pretty much new, the possibilities that are available. And on the good news end of it, it's cheaper and cheaper to do that, because different sorts of applications, programs have been developed in the last years on how to improve the use of the huge amounts of data available in order to foster specific areas of any given policy, including education. But it's true that it's being used more for other policies than education itself. So, for instance, last weekend I was in Tegucigalpa, in Honduras, helping lots of young people to use big data to develop better strategies to fight violence, to prevent violence, the so-called hackathons. So those are strategies of involving your citizens in how to also take their views and their participation with these huge amounts of data to improve the policies.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Guilherme. Really nicely answered. So the third question we have is, how do you think AI can play an important role in education? For instance, do you think it will help to achieve a more blended, personalized learning experience for a larger number of students?
I mean, first, I would do a warning. I mean, I think artificial intelligence, it's a very important topic, but I feel there is some sort of fetish around this issue. Suddenly, everyone started talking about AI and all the marvels that this can provide to many, many, many fields. But we need to acknowledge that in many areas, it's still very, very early days to really understand what are the opportunities, but also the risks of artificial intelligence in I mean, several fields. So I think we need to be careful here. And the first element is that we need to go deeper. We need to research more. We need to understand more what AI can mean for different policy fields, including education. Secondly, there are serious ethical questions related to artificial intelligences in all fields, and particularly when we are talking about fields where we have children involved, which is obviously the case of education. So I would say that a second warning related to artificial intelligence is that in any decisions regarding how to use them in education or and health and whatever should be done with a strong ethical component. I mean, these discussions, the ethical discussion, the ethical debate should be in the very heart of the idea of artificial intelligence. So, and then to go for replying the questions, I mean, there is lots of different understanding, more or less like the case of big data. Under the umbrella of artificial intelligence, people are talking about several different things. I mean, so even from the very sophisticated idea that the computers can take decisions almost by themselves regarding any specific topic, from what we already have now is that how the algorithms can accelerate different sort of elements, including education. And it's true that the assumption embedded in the question is true. I mean, when you have more sophisticated algorithms, more sophisticated artificial intelligence mechanisms, you can provide a more tailor-made education, an education that's go directly in line with the interest of each student. There is a risk here because education, it's about a public sphere issue. It's interesting that we can provide tools that make this very personalized for each student, but it's also true that we want students not only to go in this very, very narrow and specific areas that they are interested. As human beings, we need to be interested in broader perspectives in our societies. We need to connect with others. We need to connect it with other issues, even issues that we are not necessarily interested, because this is what make our decision-making capacities as citizens during elections, during issues of daily lives improved. So yes, it will help a lot. It will offer different perspectives, but let's be careful on how we will use artificial intelligence in education.
Thank you, Guilherme. Just thinking about what you're saying is, you know, informed decisions and building knowledge societies. And I think that's something that, you know, we could talk about a lot more in this session now, like the importance of building knowledge societies and how we can support governments and to promote that. No, I mean, can you elaborate more in that area? Because I think we're going to have some time. So.
Sure.
So yeah,
sure, definitely.
Yeah, sorry.
So
the importance of building knowledge societies and how we can help support governments in doing this. What is the best way? Is it through education? Is it through civil society organizations, or what? Just, you know, just kind of elaborate a bit more on that.
Definitely. I mean, I think that this is really the central question for the coming years. How we have advanced a lot, as I said earlier, in producing data, in producing information, but not necessarily in producing knowledge. So which is a big difference, because for producing knowledge, again, we need to understand our horizon, where we want to be in a given amount of time. So we could, for the sake of the example, and which of course for United Nations is crucial, we could consider the 2030 agenda. So how we can use the information and the data we have available now to achieve the goals, the 17 goals that the member states, this 193 UN member states, have established for themselves towards 2030. And for that, not only for the SDG 4 that is related to education, for all the different SDGs, there is a centrality in building knowledge societies, because building knowledge societies means to consider inclusiveness of all of the stakeholders, of all different kinds of citizens, populations, differences, ethnies, people with disabilities, genders, etc. Building knowledge societies also means to consider open and an open solution in many areas: open science, open education, open government, because this is very much related to the idea of building knowledge, in building an inclusive knowledge. So I think that here we really need to understand that this idea of building knowledge societies is not only related to the education area, to the education policies, is really a state, an overall decision of any country to move forward towards, for instance, achieving the goals of the 2030 agenda. It's a different perspective of producing and building policy. And although it's easy to say, it's not that easy to implement. It's not that easy to consider in every policy as a cross-cutting issue. This idea or this decision of everything should have this component on how we move from information to knowledge. Once we manage to do that, we have no doubt we will have better policies, including, of course, in education.
Thank you so much, Guilherme. So we have our final question, which is national research and education networks have been around in the developed world for quite some time now, unlike in the developing world, where they have just started to consolidate in the end of the 20th century. Examples being Internet 2 in the US, Giant 2 in Europe, Red Clara in Latin America, RNP in Brazil, and so on. So this learner says, in my opinion, national research and education networks could contribute greatly to quality education. How do we convince decision makers in our countries to recognize this, and how do we see to recognize this and see them as valuable entities?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we have been talking in the last 19 minutes about different components that are related to this question. One of them is this idea that policies should be more and more must have more and more multi-stakeholder perspective, which means to consider different sorts of allies, different sorts of networks in improving educational policy. And definitely one of those allies, one of those networks are the ones mentioned in this question. So this is, and this kind of networks, they can offer a very interesting perspective to education, because they are putting together different sorts of researchers, different sorts of interests, different sorts of views. And again, improving education means precisely that, how we incorporate those different views in the pedagogical process that takes place within the school space. This is for one. But then the second element of the question that is related to how we convince policymakers and decision makers. I think here there is some sort of homework for the networks themselves. I mean, it's necessary to demonstrate or to showcase with very pragmatical elements, examples, studies, etc., on the good those networks can do for educational system. I mean, policymakers are every day being presented to hundreds of different pieces of the puzzles where they need to select. So we need to be strategic in showcasing to them how those networks can help in improving the quality of education. It can't be only a statement. They are important because they are knowledge networks. We need to move further than that. We need to show to them that the work of those networks already have been helping the building of knowledge societies and improving education. So I think when decision makers and policy makers, they also have the same goal. They want to improve education. So we need to help them in understanding how the different stakeholders, how the different allies can actually help in a pragmatic way to improve the quality of education. And then, of course, we come back again to another point we have already been discussing in the last 20 minutes, that we all, including the non-governmental players, we all need to go to the initial question: which education we want to offer. I mean, what our contribution, our cooperation to the improvement of education has a previous question: is that what is our understanding of education? What exactly our contributions can change? And for answering this question, we need to understand exactly what we want to offer as an educational policy. Otherwise, it's an empty exercise, because we all have things to do, we all have things to offer, but how exactly those contributions connect with the horizon of the education we want to offer to our children, for our teenagers, or if we consider lifelong education to all the citizens in this planet. This question is super important to add value, to consider what is the value we can add from our different perspectives, including the networks mentioned in the question.
Yeah. So I think we've still got another 5 minutes left, so I might just ask you a question myself. And what I wanted to ask you, Guilherme, is in your experience, in your professional experience, do you have any case studies or any tips for developing strategies for ICTs for education, or an education for ICTs? Is there anything that could be what we would say, I can't think of the word that I'm trying to say now, but like global standards that one should consider, or what policy and decision makers should consider when coming up for strategies of ICTs for education and education for ICTs?
I mean, I think that there is not a single comprehensive and coherent policy in a given country. I think we have bits of interesting best practices coming from different places regarding the several elements of a good or a successful ICTs for education policy. But if I needed to select just one thing, is that we need to listen more to the children and the teenagers themselves. I mean, I think that they all, more than I think, I'm sure they have lots to contribute to the improvement of the policy. And particularly in this case, they are really involved in using technology every day and more in an intensive way, which does not mean that makes children and teenagers experts in ICTs for education. but definitely means that they can help decision makers and policymakers in producing better policies that will make sense to this target audience or to this target constituency. So if I needed to have time just for one tip, I would definitely say that this is super relevant, and perhaps we are not grasping the revolution we are living in regarding children's and adolescents or teenagers. Is that since the approval of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that will celebrate 30 years the next year, it was approved in 1989. Where you can find the rights of the child. I think Articles 12 and 13, freedom of expression and privacy, are there. I think it's really now is the very first time since the idea of childhood was invented, that children and teenagers are actually having the possibility of expressing freely, having actual freedom of expression. And this is a real revolution that has not been entirely included in our idea of education. So offering the space for children and teenagers to really participate in policy building, I think it's essential for the overall educational policy, but particularly for ICT for education and educations for ICTs. That said, I mean, I think during the module, I have underlined the key issues, but the current research has showed different elements. First is that ICTs, the teaching of ICTs can't be only a theoretical issue. It's very important to including a hands-on perspective. I mean, using technology to produce knowledge, to produce creativity, to offer the students the possibility of using all the different devices to move forward in a different perspective, not only as receivers of content, but as producers or builders of content. So I think this is the research is showing that if this perspective, that the technology is not only about receiving content or educational content, but also producing, increasing the capacity of being creative, we will not going to achieve the results that we are expecting.
Excellent. That was a really nice way to end a very wonderful half an hour, Guilherme. Thank you very, very much for such an insightful questions and answers. And I'd like to thank all our listeners and all those that sent in these very interesting questions. And yeah, thank you very much, Guilherme.
Thank you, my pleasure. And I do hope all of you are enjoying the MOOC and are enjoying this particular module. And please, moderator Sandra, if the students or have other questions, I'm more than happy to take them via email or another means that you consider relevant, okay?
Brilliant. So yeah, so if you have any more questions, please send them through to the Q&A section, Guilherme Canela Godoi, and where Guilherme will be happy to respond. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.